the Bible can't be trusted because there are so many different versions of the Bible.
Alright, this argument is too common, especially for how bad it is. I'm going to put it to rest once and for all.
Alright, let's see it. And the fit for today is the Mignola Hellboy.
There are a few things to say. First, that the Bible was originally written in 3 different languages, and people today speak a lot of different languages. So, a lot of translation has to occur. There are different schools of thought about how to do this. The spectrum of dynamic equivalence to formal equivalence. Dynamic is simply to get the gist of what is said. Formal is word for word and precise. So the many different versions exist on a spectrum between these 2 schools of thought.
So this content creator is trying to sound informed about Bible translation scholarship and why Bible translations differ, and they very clearly are not informed about those things. I'm going to talk about 3 main reasons why. First, they talk about functional to dynamic equivalence. This is a theoretical framework that is outdated and obsolete. Bible translation scholarship has moved well past it. It was developed in the 1960s by Eugene Nida, culminating in this 1969 book, The Theory and Practice of Translation, co-authored with James Tabor. But this brings up the second problem. This content creator has wildly misunderstood and is wildly misrepresenting the theoretical framework of formal to dynamic equivalence, which is not remotely just a question of word for word versus gist translations. It's about 2 different theories about how best to transmit meaning. According to formal equivalence, we best transmit meaning by approximating the form of the source text in the target text. So syntactical relationships, grammatical constructions, vocabulary, maybe even word order, maybe even number of words. Dynamic equivalence is based on the theory that meaning is best transmitted by trying to reproduce the function and the reception and the response to the text in the target culture. It's not about reproducing the words, it's about reproducing the effect and the reception and the response. So one example from Nida is Paul's statement, "Greet one another with a holy kiss." That was a convention in the source culture that made that statement easily understandable within that cultural context. Most target cultures today are not going to have that same convention, and so you've got to alter it to try to match the convention that comes closest to what that source convention was. So for Nida, for a 1960s English-speaking target audience, it's not going to be greet one another with a holy kiss, it's going to be hearty handshakes all around or something like that. So it's a very different translation because the theory is that we want the target audience to receive and respond to the text in a way that closely matches how the source audience would have received and responded to the text. So this content creator very clearly does not understand what dynamic equivalence means. And even Eugene Nida said when this theory was still being proliferated that people misunderstood what dynamic equivalence meant, and so he preferred and shifted to using functional equivalence. So by referring to formal versus dynamic equivalence, not only are we appealing to an outdated and obsolete theoretical framework, we're appealing to language that was already outdated and obsolete before the theoretical framework itself became outdated and obsolete. The third reason this argument is problematic is that it entirely ignores the many other dimensions of the discipline of Bible translation that can result in translations differing from one another. And probably the biggest is the question of source text, because there's not one single universally agreed upon source text for the Hebrew Bible and for the New Testament. There are numerous different ones, and either the translator has to make thousands and thousands of text-critical decisions about which reading they think is most likely, or they have to punt and just base their translation on the thousands and thousands of text-critical decisions made by the editors of those critical editions. But even then, they will usually step in many different places and overrule the critical edition using the critical apparatuses that are provided in those editions, which provide variant readings in the manuscripts that they come from, so that a translator can say, oh, I actually think this Dead Sea Scroll manuscript over here has a better reading than what's in the Leningrad Codex. But another translator over here might say, well, I actually think this other Dead Sea Scroll manuscript over here has a better reading than both the Leningrad Codex and your Dead Sea Scroll manuscript. And when it comes to the New Testament, there are even more manuscripts available. So while there is a kind of standard deviation that most translations stay within, there are many, many differences between translations that result from text-critical decisions being made by the translators.
This does not pose an issue for Christianity. I checked to see what Haven would say to this question. It gave a good, concise answer confirming this.
Using AI to try to confirm outdated theories of Bible translation is way off base, but additionally, that answer itself is promoting dogmas of inspiration, inerrancy, and univocality, and also it has a bad translation of 2 Timothy 3:16 there, because it uses the word inspired, which is rendering theopneustos. But as I've discussed in other videos, the word theopneustos did not come to mean inspired in the sense that we understand it today and use it in 2 Timothy 3:16 until the 3rd century CE, when Origen innovated that renegotiation of the term. Prior to Origen, theopneustos was used to mean life-giving. So not God-breathed in the sense of inspired, but God-breathed in the sense of God breathed the breath of life into the first human. So life-giving, which is why the word is used to refer to streams of water or even sandals or ointments that were used to try to preserve the lifelike nature of deceased people for 3 days in case the spirit returned to the body within that short window of time. So even this translation is problematic, is not what the original authors were trying to communicate, and it is a problem for Christianity, for the proof text for their notion of biblical inspiration to be a mistranslation.
To wrap up, these translations or versions do not prevent us from knowing what the original actually meant.
On the contrary, both translations and versions can very easily get in the way of us understanding not just what the authors meant, but what they even just wrote.
It is not a translation of a translation of a translation. It is translated directly from the original language to the desired language. It is not a series of steps that lead to corruption.
So this is 50% accurate. It is a bit of a pet peeve of mine when people say that the Bible was translated into Greek and then into Latin and only then into English, and it's been translated from translations. That's nonsensical. However, again, this creator is flatly ignoring the fact that our source texts don't just fall from the sky and all match identically.
And lastly, it's important to remember, as textual scholar Michael Holmes remarks, the sheer volume of information from available manuscripts makes it practically certain that the original text has been preserved.
So that's a rough approximation of this quote by Holmes, which comes from this 1991 book. So let's fast forward to 2010, when Holmes released this version of a paper that he presented at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature in 2006. Let's see what he has to say in 2010. Another reason for our continuing impasse is the failure to carry our method to its logical conclusion. Recensio can indicate the closest surviving reading, but it cannot, even as modified by Zuntz, tell us whether it is the original reading. This is where the further stages of examinatio and, if necessary, emendatio come into play. Yet it is precisely here that the discipline has declined to go. In practice, and often in theory, the assumption is widespread that the original reading must have survived somewhere among the extant witnesses. Yes, that is the very assumption that Holmes asserted in 1991 and here is throwing into question. Some assert this as a matter of principle. Others do so by default, by declining to take seriously, even if only theoretically, the possibility of the need to amend the text of the New Testament. This failure amounts to a squandering of our resources, a neglect of evidence that, if properly used, could enable us to penetrate beyond the limits of the extant tradition. Here, both Westcott and Hort and Zuntz agree against the contemporary rejection or neglect of emendation. We tend to forget, the title of their edition notwithstanding, that Westcott and Hort marked some 65 places where they suspected the presence of some primitive corruption antecedent to all extant witnesses and recognized in these cases the need for emendation. Here is a part of their legacy that needs to be recovered.
This argument is horrendous, goofy, and belongs in the dumpster. People should stop using it. Let me know if y'all have any other common objections you want me to refute. God bless.
What I want is for you to get educated about these topics before you presume to speak authoritatively about them and mislead people into thinking you have the foggiest idea what you're talking about.